Hello, thinkers. Welcome back to the Apex Mind. This was a very impromptu Apex Arena episode that we had to do because of the recent Javed Akhtar versus Mufti Shamail topic on does God exist? And since that is a big theme on the channel, I thought it was appropriate to discuss this. And it was thanks to Vivaswan that I ended up doing it. I don't think I would have been doing it otherwise. By the way, face reveal for Vivaswan. He has been a very regular guest on the channel, and now you guys get to see him as well. So let's begin with the debate discussion. Vivasan, you can tell the audience what their initial conditions were for the debate and why that was problematic.
Yeah, so Mufti Shamail, when he gave his introduction speech, he set up some conditions upon which the debate would be held, what he called as standards. And so there were many. So we can talk about the three main conditions that he laid up. The first was we
Mhm,
don't have to use science or scientific evidence anyhow, because
mhm,
he said that, he gave an analogy of how you can't detect plastic by a metal detector. And so
right.
you cannot use science or physical evidence, something like that, to
Mhm,
derive the existence of a
mhm,
being who is not physical. And
right.
second, so this first was like acceptable, it was not problematic. So
Mhm,
second condition which he laid out was that
mhm,
we shall not talk about revelations. We shall not talk about the
mhm,
books of revelations of the Quran or something like that, which it
mhm,
was also quite clear because you cannot use the same thing to prove itself. And
right.
the third one was not to use emotional arguments like the problem of evil or why is there evil, something like that. Now, this one
Mhm,
was problematic. So this
mhm,
one, this third one was problematic, and the first one was also problematic because if someone is a physicalist and someone says that I just
mhm,
believe in whatever the physical world is and whatever the evidence says, then we can establish a very strong grounds upon which that condition would
mhm,
be false.
right.
Because
Mhm.
Javed Akhtar, I don't think violated any of these. I think he just asked
He
in a
did bring up
debate
the
about
problem
the
of evil.
problem of evil.
He did bring
Yeah,
up the problem of evil.
yeah.
Yeah,
So he
so that
brought that
was
up,
one thing.
and so I don't think any of those were broken like very strongly or something that we would object on. But Mufti Shamail
Mhm.
was quite, you know, uh,
He laid the groundworks for his argument in
yeah,
the
yeah.
initial conditions itself. I understand that he wanted to go with the contingent argument, and he never really actually explained very well what contingency means. From what I have read about what happened behind the scenes, is that someone coached him for a week about certain terms and certain arguments, and that is what he was regurgitating on the stage. But see, so the three conditions that he laid down. Uh, I I don't think I necessarily have a problem with any, as long as he does not contradict himself, which he did later on. So the first condition was that since God is a metaphysical being, therefore we should not use physical evidences for proving God's existence. So that should immediately disqualify any concept of God which is non-metaphysical, right? Any physical evidence of God should be then not considered. Therefore, you are very very clearly removing any religious interpretations of God out of it, because religious interpretations, they don't claim that God is physical, but the things that God does, that is physical, and those require physical evidences. If you say that God parted the sea, but we do not have any evidence for God parting the sea, in fact we end up having the evidence of God not parting the sea, then that is completely false, right? So that event did not happen, that physical thing did not happen. God turning water into wine, if we cannot prove that can happen, so either you call it a miracle or you give some evidence of those things. So that should even the first condition itself should disqualify any religious talk. The second condition, he does it explicitly by saying that we cannot use revelations as proof, which would be idiotic anyway, so of course he had to do that. And thirdly was the problem of evil. Again, the problem of evil, the moment you start discarding that, that also implicitly discards the Abrahamic conception of God, which is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, and all like whatever, like that conception of God then cannot be talked about, because the problem of evil only exists when you claim that God is all powerful, all knowing, and all good. Right? Only then can the problem of evil exist. So it can really only exist for that conception of God. Therefore, what he was essentially trying to do, he was trying to divorce the religious God from the metaphysical idea of a necessary being. So he was laying the groundworks for the his argument, which is fine because Javed Akhtar did agree to it preemptively as well. So I guess that cannot be said to be non-fair play. That is my idea on what happened with the premises.
Yeah, of course. He laid the foundations very cleverly because when we talk about the Abrahamic concept of God, the obvious problem is the problem of evil. And when you just discard it by saying as an emotional argument, of course, it can be emotional when you give explicit examples of what is happening and what is not happening. But when you lay down it as just a premise-wise a syllogistic argument, then that's not at all something that can be considered as emotional. Of course, it has an emotional weight also, and that's why it has been, the most powerful argument against the Abrahamic concept of God since about 2,300 years. So that's the reason which I think was a bit problematic when he laid his last condition. That was something which I am concerned about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think as long as both the parties agreed with those conditions, that should not be an issue. I mean, if that was the first time he introduced those conditions and did not do it before a debate, obviously then it is problematic. But then Javed Akhtar should not have agreed to those conditions anyway. And then they like go on for like multiple rounds with him hammering down the contingency argument, and Javed Akhtar essentially giving a like dodging that particular argument, and giving a lot of analogies. I think I have a list of what happened in the debate as well. Let me just give it a look. So yeah, contingency argument a lot. We will actually talk about the contingency argument just later on in this discussion, because it is the meat of this argument. Let's talk about everything else. So he said that because this was a good one, by the way. He said that because human beings made our own rules, right? You should drive on the left side of the road. That you should do certain things, you shouldn't do certain things. Therefore, rules. In general are subjective in nature depending on what human beings decide, and therefore like even the concept of these rules is like ultimately leading to what, like the concept of right and wrong, the concept of justice, and that does not actually exist in nature. We make it up. So he was arguing about the what do you call it? The weight of what justice means, the weight of what good and wrong means. He was clearly laying down that it is subjective, so a subjective morality argument, to which the reply was a bit baffling to me, because Mufti there argued that no, but that is just subjective morality. You did not talk about objective morality. Morality is objective. But in morality, you have to show that morality is objective, right? You just can't come in and claim morality is objective. And in order to prove morality is objective, he does what exactly? He makes an emotional argument. He makes an emotionally manipulative argument. He goes, "Oh, if morality is subjective, then one day all of you guys can decide that murder is not wrong, or like our wording is not wrong." And that's where the audience. That is where Javed Akhtar could not even reply. But that was a very sly move, because in his starting three conditions, he made it clear that they ought not to do emotional arguments. Then he goes on to do that.
Yes, of course. And when you just look at the later sentence, so when he said that, we should not use emotional arguments, and then he later goes on to the problem of evil and says that, evil is not actually something that disproves God, rather it is something that actually proves God. But the argument which he used for that was completely emotional. What argument he used was, if evil did not exist, then people who seek for revenge or something like that will never be having justice or something like that. So it would be kind of a bad thing to not have justice given, because many people don't get justice even after they die. So that was completely an emotional argument used by his side, because when you say that we don't have to use emotional arguments, and on the next line you say that if people don't have evil, then they would not get justice or something like that. So this was a completely emotional point that was laid by him. And
Insanely
to go
emotional.
away with, yeah, of course, and to go away with the definition of contingency also, he also did some problems there.
Yeah, definitely. I think one issue, I guess, he said that, okay, so justice exists. That was premise one. Justice exists. Justice should be given. And there are situations in life where people do not get justice and they end up dying. Therefore, there should exist a place where justice happens. So, even the premise one is an assumption. And the conclusion is such a big leap. The clear conclusion here would have been justice is something that we want to exist, and that some people don't get justice, therefore justice does not always exist, right? But no, you'll create an imaginary entity, you'll create an imaginary place of existence where justice ought to exist. It's logically very redundant. I don't know. I want to say like a very abusive word at this point, but yeah, it's not logically good, at least.
Yes, because I don't think that there are any good arguments even given from his side about to tell what moral realism is on, or what, how can he prove that there is justice or something like that. And it's not that
Mhm.
it is his fault of whether he wants to prove moral realism or not. Even very good
Mhm.
philosophers like William Lane Craig or something, some people like them,
Mhm.
the best argument. So there was an interesting paper written by Peter Van Inwagen, and it was on
Mhm.
metaethics and how uh, free will and everything, those things relate. And so he gave a very good argument against the existence of free will.
Mhm.
And then at the last of the
Right.
paper, what he concluded is that free will still exists because it is so intuitive that
Mhm.
free will exists. uh, the intuition factor he used to say
Insane.
that free will must of course exist. And so even William Lane Craig admits that the best argument for moral realism is that our intuitions say that of course some things are absolutely bad, it doesn't matter when they are done or something like that. So of course
Mhm.
I will still say that he did not give an independent argument for moral realism, but it would be kind of dishonest for me to say that, because I don't think there is any good argument to give for moral realism.
Yeah, I mean, even if there is no good argument to give for moral realism, okay, what happened? All right. So even if there is no good argument for moral realism, I don't think that excuses that stance anyway. Don't take that stance if you cannot justify it, right? Just because it's a difficult stance, then don't take it. Don't make a moral realist stance if it is so hard for you to justify it. So I don't think that excuses him at all. Having said all of that about his points, I do think Javed Akhtar was out of his depth on this one completely, and he was sidestepping a lot of things. Sometimes he was like mostly he was arguing about the religion. He even had a slip of tongue, what do you call a Freudian slip, where he said instead of Khuda, he said Allah, because these two guys are arguing not about God as a concept, they're arguing about Allah. That is what they were arguing about. They were masking it under the concept of God. The whole thing should have been titled, Does Allah Exist? Right? That is what was going on. But yeah, his arguments were like pretty bad, right? But let's for the time being, let's still go over the mistakes made by Mufti, because Javed Akhtar was a whole case.
Yeah. So let's start from what he laid as an argument, right? So let's start from
Mhm.
the first analogy that he gave. If you were in an
Mhm.
isolated island and you saw a ball, and
Mhm.
so you must ask, how did that ball come about? And that's what you would ask. And he said that just enlarge that ball up to the size of the universe, and then the question will still remain the same. And the argument which Javed Akhtar gave against this was quite interesting. And it
Mhm.
was actually this one of the arguments which was given in a very professionally academic book also. What Javed Akhtar said
Mhm.
was, you ask for the ball, not for the island itself. And Why is it the case? Because the reason we ask why does that ball come here is because of the very, obvious thing that we know, that of course this is made by men and this is artificially made. So
Mhm.
when there is this teleological argument given for how things come about, the first thing
Mhm.
to say about these arguments is to say that we don't look at their complexity and their function and then derive if it was made by men. We just
Or
obviously know that it is made by men, and therefore we have this kind of inclination to do that. It is very unusual if someone asks, he goes to an isolated island and he sees many trees, and then he asks, oh my god, how did these trees come about? And the answer which Mufti gave, which was, both the things are contingent. Now,
Mhm.
there is a bit difficulty in actually saying that these things are contingent, because so this was the main difficulty about his definition of contingency, because
Mhm.
the basic definition which he gave about contingency, it was a thing is contingent, this pen is contingent if it is dependent on something else for its existence. Now,
Mhm.
there are quite many cases where we can say that things are dependent on something else, still they are not contingent, they
Mhm.
are necessary. Now,
Mhm.
how can we say such things? So first of all, let's imagine there is some necessary stuff, and
Mhm.
if that thing X is necessary and it just necessarily entails Y. If X necessarily exists and X necessarily entails Y, then although Y is dependent on X for its existence, but still Y becomes necessary, right? Y is not
Mhm.
contingent on anything, it just is necessary. So just
Right.
saying that, if things are dependent on some other things, then they are contingent, that's not actually quite the complete definition. We have to say that contingent things are those things that are not metaphysically necessary, or which
Mhm.
could have failed to exist, right? So when we
Mhm.
say that the necessary thing X entails Y necessarily, then
Mhm.
Y could not have failed to exist in any world, right? It just is metaphysically
Mhm.
necessary, and it
Because
could have
both of
never
their
failed to
existence are
exist.
tied together.
Yeah, so that's why
Yeah.
although Y is dependent, it is also necessary. It is not contingent.
Right.
So that was
Mhm.
the first thing uh, about the contingency thing. And although I think that Javed Akhtar, did uh, things that were not at all very logical, and because he did not aim for the existence of God, mainly what he argued for was the merits and demerits of religion and everything like that. So his arguments were very shallow, and I mean, comparatively, of course, Mufti was a very good debater, and his logic was also strong there. uh, and this can be the starting point of the contingency argument.
Mhm. So, just to make something very clear, so do does contingency argument necessarily entail that something ought to be dependent on the other for or for its existence, or that everything is an effect and every effect requires a cause, like everything follows from something else?
Yeah, so contingency argument is based upon the scientific observation of things being
Mhm.
dependent onto each other. And because that is said, then this pen is contingent, then the person who made it was contingent upon their parents and something like that. So that's the contingency argument. Basically, you take the things which are the things which could have been otherwise, and you say that okay, now we have this set of contingent things, and now we ask whether this set itself, is it contingent. If it is contingent, then we have to say that the creator of this set or the cause of this set could not have been contingent itself, because if it was contingent, then it would have been
Yeah,
in the
I get.
set itself.
Yeah, I get that. See,
Yeah.
I see a difference between something being dependent on something for its existence and something being a effect of something, right? So I this can it is not dependent on me, right? This perfume bottle is not dependent on me, but it falling down now was dependent on my action, my cause, right? Things changed their form. It went from state A to state B because I was the cause for it, right? So that, given the nature of the universe, right, where do things come from is not something that we necessarily can put everything under. We cannot say that everything's existence is dependent on something else, because ultimately where do you reach? Everything was taking different forms and it was the Big Bang, right? These are not separate things, these are things changing form. But cause and effect does apply. So but it does contingency argument also contain this idea of cause and effect, or is it solely about dependence of existence based on something else? Because in that case, I think it's not as all encompassing when talking about the universe.
Yeah, so it is actually based on the dependency of things on their existence itself. So when you said that, the falling of this pen was dependent on me, so the contingency argument does not say about this. It just is concerned about whether that thing exists contingently or not, right? So when we just say,
Hmm.
when we just talk about their existence and their being, that is what the contingency argument is concerned about mainly.
Yeah.
And so there are various things to be considered, right? Because when we talk about the universe being contingent, so firstly what we can argue against is that, although all of these contingent things are making a set, now it is
Hmm.
not actually quite obvious if this entire set is contingent or not, right? This set
Right.
can be necessarily true. Other thing to say
Hmm.
is, now this is about scientific determinism again. What determinism implies is something that is quite undermining the concept of contingency, right? So
Hmm.
firstly what we have is determinism, and what it says is that if any effect happens, then it had some prior cause, right? And if it had a prior cause, and that had a prior cause, and it went towards the Big Bang. Now if that is the chain, then it is not quite contingent in that actual sense, right? Because it was just bound to happen given the chain of causes that were initiated by the Big Bang. Now
Hmm.
uh, contingent things just mean that, it could have failed to exist. But if we are saying that this causal chain was just, necessary because the Big Bang was necessary, then it just follows that these things which are happening right now aren't actually contingent. These could have not failed to exist, they would just be there. Now, of course,
Right.
this is physical possibility which I'm talking about, but there are also different kinds of possibilities. For example, when we are talking about, whether this thing is like whether this thing could have been otherwise, then we are talking about
Hmm.
logical possibility. So logical
Hmm.
possibility, I don't think that is quite relevant into this topic, because take this example. For example, um, there was a child, and 7 to 10 years old, and he is just poor and doesn't know anything. He cannot read or write. Now I tell him to give the UPSC exam, and now when I tell, it's like basically certain for me that, he's going to fail the exam because he cannot even read or write. Now if that's the case, and when he fails the exam and comes back home, I beat him up. Why? Because there was a logically consistent scenario where he could have passed the exam. So there is a
Hmm.
difference between physical possibility and where to consider physical possibilities, and where to consider logical possibilities. We cannot just take that
Right.
child and say that, because it was logical that you could have passed, I'm now beating you. There should be a physical possibility that should, be accompanied with the logical possibility to make it a meaningful thing in itself. So when I say that this thing is contingent, I have to, say that it was both logically and physically contingent. But it does not actually follow that it was physically contingent given determinism. But we can say that it was logically, contingent.
Contingent again. Then I think this could also then be used to say that if you say God is a metaphysical entity and God is beyond physicality, then how do you bridge the gap between non-physicality and physicality? Like how is non-physical being able to affect the physical? You have yet to demonstrate this, yet you make the claim that it does. I get that. I think the main thing again, I think when you say that something is dependent on something else for its existence, I think I necessarily have a problem with that statement in itself as well. Because again, this piece of plastic, it uh, it didn't it whoever shaped it, whatever factory it came from, whatever like polycarbons it is made out of, uh, it simply changed form, right? The effect required a cause, but its existence was not dependent the existence of it in this form. So it simply causes an effect on things that already exist. Bringing things into existence is never quite demonstrated ever. All we have seen is that causes cause effect. Like there is a cause and there is an effect. We've yet to see something come into existence out of nothing. Again, that is the main gap, right? Again, go back to the whole. Okay, you say that physicality started here and like non-physical gave birth to physical, but it's still is the same problem that science is also dealing with, that if you claim there was nothing before it, if there was nothing, how do you define the transition from nothing to something? Even religion is not answering that exactly, right? They're saying that there is a logical possibility of God, fine, but again you get to answer the question of the non-physical to physical thing. So I think the contingency argument works if you firstly take it as cause and effect, right? Because I'm going to not have a problem with the whole ontology thing also that we discussed. I think last week we discussed, right? Like this ontology itself, as in like things actually existing, is a whole weird concept of how that is happening. But yeah, fine. See, he did not physically demonstrate it. He was not able to give evidences, and he will have to therefore those claims are problematic. But again, in the beginning of the debate itself, he did say that we're talking about logical possibilities, we're talking about metaphysical possibilities, so perhaps we can give him a pass on that.
Yes, we can. I don't think so that it is necessarily a very big problem. Uh, so there are
Mm-hmm.
3 points to say, and I understand what
Mm-hmm.
you're coming at, right, when you're talking about causes and effects. So the first problem, of course, was the problem from non-simplicity, and it is actually a very big problem specifically for Islam because there is the concept of tawheed, right, absolute oneness, and that's the problem because. Uh, just imagine when it was just just imagine a point where God was just God. The entire existence was just God. Nothing other than God existed. Now when we look at that point and say that, okay, how did something other than God come about? If God is absolutely one, he cannot be broken into parts. How did he create something other than God? Was it out of nothing, or
Mm-hmm.
was it by himself differentiating into some things? Now this is
Right.
actually a very big problem for Islam, which is called the problem of non-simplicity. Now the second point which you said was interesting, and it is actually in a debate, actually. So the thing which you highlighted, thus that this pen does not actually come into existence. There are parts of it already there. We just rearrange them into things, and then we say that the pen exists. This is called mereological nihilism, and this basically says that things in itself don't exist, just their parts are rearranged. Now,
Mm-hmm.
there are 2 points to say here. The first is when you say that only the parts exist, only the properties exist. That is something called the bundle theory, and we have the substance theory again, right? I think we have talked
Mm-hmm.
about it, like electron having all its properties. Then you ask, what is the electron actually in itself?
What is the
But
substance? Yeah.
yeah, but there is no electron if you just say that there are only properties, right? So when
Mm-hmm.
when when a person is trying to come from the contingency arguments stance, he would actually have to accept this substance theory and say that
Mm-hmm.
there are things in themselves, which is basically very hard to say because take this pen and let's say the property of this pen is that it is black in color, it is having plastic, it is having ink and everything. Now these are all
Mm-hmm.
properties of this pen. And now if you remove all of
Right.
these properties, what remains? And that's exactly
Mm-hmm.
the point. Nothing remains. So
Mm-hmm.
the person who says that in the contingency argument things actually come into existence, he has to somehow prove that things actually exist in themselves rather than just being aggregates of some other things. And the other point, the third last point which you highlighted, which was extremely important again, which was the interaction problem, as I said. You cannot have physical things emerging from non-physical things. That is the principle of causal closure. It basically cannot be violated.
And so I think we went on to a very high level tangent given the subject matter that was this pathetic attempt at a debate between Javed Akhtar and Mufti Shamil. But yeah, so I have a lot of problems with the contingency argument. Yet I have to again concede on the fact that Javed Akhtar was not able to tackle that, and that was like something he completely gave up on. In the like whole broader picture of the debate, Javed Akhtar was never really engaging with it except for like 2 3 points that he did engage, but beyond that he was just talking about religion. So as far as the results of the debates are considered, if I had to pick a winner, I mean, I would mostly just disqualify both of them because they violated the conditions that they set out in the very beginning. Why are you talking about the problem of evil when you decided you're not going to talk about it? Why are you bringing in the certain conception of God, and then like when you're questioned on those conceptions of God, you're dodging the question. So technically, both of them are disqualified. But if I had to pick a winner, I will have to go with Mufti. And let's just like quickly also go over some of the other things that they discussed. For example, again, interesting problem that I have with Mufti is that when Javed Akhtar pointed out that everything happens in time, right? Like even though he did it in his attempt, that everything requires a time to happen. If I throw this, it moves in time, and therefore, what was God doing before that? Was he just sitting around, laying around? The rebuttal actually exposed Mufti's argument when he said that God is atemporal technically, right? God is not bound by time. Yet you claim that God created, and as that would require flowing in time, that would require at least two states: a state of non creation and a state of creation. If you have to bridge those two states, you have to introduce time. He did not claim that God was in a higher dimension of time. He clearly claimed that God was not affected by time. So the intemporality argument actually makes his position even weaker.
Yes, and that is, I mean, also, um, it's a considerable point because we cannot even conceive of change with, you know, in a state where change is just impossible. And atemporality is the prime example of that. And so there are quite many things because whenever people, like one of my friend asked me that what is the most consistent theory of God that you would say. I told him that, exclude one of the three properties and then exclude the atemporality tag and exclude that he knows the future somehow. So, atemporality is a very big problem, right? You basically
Yes.
somehow say that, God is not bound by time. So he is,
Mhm.
making him very supreme. And just in the steps of making him supreme, you're just making that incoherent. And
Right.
it seems to me, and this is my personal belief, I don't think so that everyone will agree with me, but it seems to me that time just is necessary, right? It is not possible
Mhm.
for time not to exist. It just exists
Mhm.
everywhere.
Mhm. I mean, at the very least, given like unless we are going to assume a higher dimension, right? If we have to assume that, then perhaps we can claim it's like a what do you call a nested thing, like different times going within different times, like a game thing that we discussed in our last meet. But other than that, again, given the law of non-contradiction and given how we understand things to work, there is no logical way of going from step A to step B or state A to state B without going through time. That is simply not possible in the way that we understand things. So either you'll have to supersede logic, that logicality does not apply on God, but then you cannot use logical arguments to prove God. Because then again, if you are already claiming that he's illogical, then how are you going to prove him by logical arguments? Or you have to conceive of a higher realm of existence, a higher dimensional thing, and again, that will be an axiom that you're going to take, that will be an assumption that you're going to take, that you will not be able to demonstrate that it does exist, right? At least, not that we have discussed this. Perhaps if we do another episode, we might be able to figure out a way to logically prove there is another temporal plane. But Yeah, I think it's a self-defeating argument. The moment you claim atemporality, you should give up your argument of God at that very instance. And beyond this, I think God of gaps was something that was pointed out. Right? Why should we not stop at universe existing, and why should we stop at a necessary being? But I think again, it's just if you take the contingency argument, it is just a logical endpoint. But then you do, but that necessary existence can be anything. That does not specify your kind of God. So no, all good, all benevolent. It does not even specify that it has to be a being, a necessary thing, a necessary effect, necessary, a necessary dash, whatever. We don't know something necessary. Necessariness is something we can prove, nothing else. And temporality is done. Okay, where we stop the answers, that is God. That is also something that Mufti said, that like when all the answers stop, the last answer is God. Again, you're making up a metaphysical entity, you're not proving Allah. So yeah, I will give you that God argument. I'm not going to give you that Abrahamic God argument. Do not use that to prove Allah. And then one another mistake, this is my pet peeve, was that Javed Akhtar gave an argument out of pragmatic utility, where he was like, what is the use of God? Essentially, why should we believe in God? Stupid argument. I do not like fallacious argument. And then it was a discussion on problem of evil. We should discuss this, even though it went out of the scope and the conditions of their own debate. Yet that was probably the most back and forth we had. Otherwise, they were like speaking on different tangents. So, what do you have to say about their problem of evil argument?
Um, I would not have liked, Mufti Shamail just excluding the problem of evil. I did not like that at all. But because that's the only argument that is the most accepted one to argue against the Abrahamic concept. And okay, so there are quite many things that he said. The first one was evil is needed, uh, like for you must have God as the standard to define evil. That is the standard moral
Mhm,
law argument. Then the second thing which he said, that you cannot have good and evil without contrasting them. So that is also one thing which he said. Now the problem with this contrasting, the obvious problem is that the magnitude of evil that we have is never
mhm,
needed to understand any good. Like so
mhm,
for example, if there were no genocide in Auschwitz, Germany, we still would have
mhm.
understood what good and bad is. So
Right.
I very well agree with this concept of contrasting parts. That's one of the key
Mhm,
ways actually to define good and bad in contrast to
mhm,
themselves. So I don't disagree with that. I
mhm,
just disagree that you can give this argument against the problem of evil, because we don't
mhm.
need such magnitudes of evil to understand goods, right? We would have,
Right.
like for example, uh, we would have not needed any kind of uh, like world wars or anything like that to understand good. So the main problem is with the
Right.
magnitude. I don't have any other problem with this. The second thing is grounding morality into God. Now, of course, I
Mhm,
don't usually get into moral debates and something like that, because they get to very repugnant conclusions, right? So because,
mhm,
so for example, I believe in one, just a pragmatic principle that um, if it is wrong, then it is wrong for someone, right? Or else it is not wrong. But the reason I
mhm,
don't debate this is because it leads to very problematic conclusions. Like, for example, in necrophilia, you don't have someone there.
mhm,
So if
mhm,
I want to say that, it's only wrong if it is wrong for someone, and necrophilia, there is no someone who is being harmed, therefore necrophilia is not wrong. Now,
mhm.
that's why this leads to repugnant conclusions, and that's why I don't debate moral topics, because they are just quite gross, and I don't talk about that. But that's one of the ways. For example, you can ask how. Let's take a man who believes that there are no
Mhm,
morals, and let's take a man who believes that morals are grounded in God. Now, a person murders someone. Now, what are these two going to say to that person? Let's see. Now, this person who does not believe in morals is not going to be able to say anything to that person. So that person will not have any obligation or anything to say that, okay, I would not murder from now. He has no reason to say
Mhm.
from the point of that person. Now let's see what the person who believes in morals has to say. Now he will be able to say that, okay, God says that murder is wrong, and he is just ultimate authority, and therefore murder will be wrong. But still, this person will never be able to produce the normative authority. I mean, he would not be able to obligate that person of why should I not be able to murder. I mean, there is no bridge to the is to what problem, even if you believe in God. For example, if someone says that God is just the ultimate authority, that still is just an is statement. God is the authority. It does not follow that therefore you ought to follow the authority. That is not the case. You can say that God helps us to define good and bad. God gives us the concept of good or bad. it I completely agree with all of those things. The thing is that no one
Does
can produce an ought from that.
does hell somehow like bridge the eastward gap that God is the authority? He dictates that something should be done, and if you don't do it, you go to hell. The consequences give you the odd.
Um, Logically, no, it still doesn't produce, but it can, of course, obligate most persons to, in terms of fear. Like you can just fear about that and say that, okay, I would
It's
not
like
do
the
that.
company
But
CEO thing, right? The company of the company CEO, like, or the company founder, gives five rules. You follow him, and you can always say that you follow him because he's the founder, but you also follow him because consequences lead you to get out, like get kicked out of that company. That could be the analogy here.
yeah, that could be an analogy. I think that's a more pragmatic solution to it, because if a person is not caring about hell, if he does not care about getting fired from the company, he still can logically break the rules and have no obligation over it. And still, the person who is like, if someone comes and says that you are now getting fired from the company and you will just be gone, and he says it doesn't matter to me, I will just do break the rules, and now
Yeah.
still the other person has no logical way to obligate him internally. It would be very odd to say that that this thing is bad, but it's no obligation for you to not do this thing, right? It's odd. So when we say that this thing is bad, it just is internal to us to say that therefore you must not do that thing. That they are kind of
Right.
very similar sentences here, but those cannot be bridged right now, at least.
I think that this is to odd gap like ends up being in almost all moral frameworks, at least that I have come across. There is like no way of like art is assumed. It's never like shown. It's always assumed. And one thing that I wanted to point out, very like I was itching to point this out, was that when you said that you don't have a problem when he says that evil exists to show us what good is, right? So evil is to show the contrast, the duality, right? That doesn't explain the existence of evil. That just shows us there is a duality, right? Why was the need for evil in the first place? Why is there a need to show what good is? Like, make the goddamn universe and make it good. You don't need to show us that there is like evil. What was the
Yeah,
point of it? This is explaining what is. This is not explaining why it is.
yeah. So there are things. So there are primary goods and there are secondary goods. So, for example, primary goods are things that you can experience even from a line of neutrality. You have the neutral line, and then you can experience good. But there are some
Mhm.
goods that can be only experienced in the context of the existence of bad. For example, you cannot have bravery. You cannot have compassion without those bad things. So the general argument is that. Let's imagine God created a perfect universe where there is no evil, there just is good. Now the let's say this is the universe A, and in the universe B, the universe journeys to perfection rather than just being in the state of perfection. Now what will be there is that in this A universe we don't have the goods associated with the bad, right? There are just perfect goodnesses. Now when this second universe will journey to perfection, it will have the goods of this universe, plus it will have the goods that are associated with the existence of evils. So this in
Mhm.
overall magnitude will be a greater universe because there would be more goods. Now, of course, this, as you said, the Stuart problem is just universal to almost all the moral systems, and that's one of the reason which that made me just, because I was talking with my sister and she actually highlighted that you cannot have a Stuart problem in any, like you cannot solve it in any meta-ethical framework, and that's what put me in the stance of moral nihilism, because we have discussed about this earlier. I was a contractualist earlier, and so
Mhm.
I still did not get how to solve this dot problem, because
Mhm.
one can say that you can have the advantage of having God, but God does not.
Mhm.
God gives you the definition of good and bad. He does not give you that you ought to do good and bad. I can still say in my physicalist
Mhm.
framework that evolution will give you the descriptive nature of good and bad, or what good and bad are pragmatically, but it will still not give you why you should ought to do good and bad. So both the physicalist and the theist have the concepts of good and bad, but none of them is able to produce the ought needed for me to at least
Ought is always
consider that.
dependent on some axiom, some goal, some axiom. If you do not have that, how are you going to explain that ought, right?
Yeah,
And
so there can be tautological oughts, like you can have that if you want to pick up this pen, you ought to put your hand forward to pick up this. So my
as far as
want
morality
is,
is considered, yeah, go ahead, go ahead. Sorry.
no, there is no problem. Like you can explain it just in terms of is. Like if you are saying that X, the apex mind is a good person, therefore he ought
Mhm.
to act good. That's just
Mhm.
definitional embedding of ought. That can be very well allowed, but there's no obligation for anyone to just be good.
So, what about this? Living beings strive to survive. Therefore, living beings should survive. Should should strive to survive.
I think this is very broad. It does not
Mhm.
say of what survival, like which kind of survival matters. If someone is
That is,
having
yeah.
their goals,
Mhm.
and if someone is having other goals,
But
and for this survival he kills this, I think we cannot say that this person did bad in terms of this definition.
right, that is fine. I'm just like trying to like ground some thing in which morals can be survival, reproduction. Those could be two axioms that we can use, and then we can show that the more efficient way of achieving that is by forming a group, is by forming society, is by making sure the collective lives on because of whatever. Like as long as you have that those natural instincts, those can act in the tautological like argument that you give.
Yes, because um, so survival is also a very good way to ground it, right? Because we can always say that uh,
Mhm.
any action you do, for example, that there is going a mass murder in some place. Now there
Mhm.
is a possibility that if you don't oppose them, if you don't say that they are bad, someday they will also get you. Now this can be a
Mhm.
very kind of probabilistic kind of thing, but it will give you a very good reason to be calling them bad or good or something like that, to obligate them ethically. This survival can be
Right.
a thing. The second, a very interesting thing is to say that if literally, if we take in consideration all the people of this planet, now if we ask
Mhm.
them, okay, so there
Mhm.
can be communities who like cannibalism or any things like that, but we have to look, okay, what the entire majority believes in. If that say that this is good, then
Democratic.
that would be good, right? That can be a way.
Right.
Now people like to bring up hypotheticals, that if everyone like to murder, or everyone like to, that is good for a hypothetical, but I don't think that's physically possible. Once you take in evolutionary things, it is very basically impossible for a species to like to murder someone just for like that.
Actually, collective good can also be shown through nature's is right. For example, a lot of animals sacrifice their like own lives or like immediate benefits so that the whole community survives sometimes, and that is the whole self sacrifice instinct within men also. So
Yeah,
maybe we can also show that as a third driver, right?
yeah,
Personal
that can
survival,
be also.
then there is
Yeah,
reproduction, then there is this, and these three drivers, if we put it in the emotivist contractualist framework. So with the feel what is good and right is often decided by our feelings, and these feelings are motivated by contractualism. And the core axioms is personal survival, collective survival, and the third is reproduction. Maybe that could be a nice moral framework.
Yeah, that can be a very pragmatically helpful moral framework. Now,
Then you can actually tell people what to do or not to do.
yes.
But yeah, back
So
to Javed Akhtar and Mufti.
so there were 3 points I think I noted when you were talking about that. The first
There
is
is also the free will argument,
impossibility. Yeah, of course.
the
He
evil,
just
evil for free will.
invoked the free will
Bad.
argument as if he just knows that free will exists or something like that. Now
And even if it does,
there are
even if it does, how do you prove the death of a baby? Like again, like how do you prove the death of a cancerous baby? What he said was that because God is omniscient and therefore God knows everything and therefore it makes sense. So is that not basically invoking the God of gaps fallacy?
no, that's actually not a god of the gaps. That's skeptical theism. So that basically says that we are humans, we are cognitively limited. We cannot know God's plans. He's omniscient, all good. So he might have very well plans decided for us. So even if there is a possibility that he must have plans, then it follows that we cannot derive a contradiction, right? Because contradiction just is if you are sure that he does not have any reason. If it is even possible that he can have reason, then the contradiction doesn't follow.
So it's one of those, like, what do you call, the rhetorically forced, the logically forced, but not very compelling argument
Yeah,
kind. I get that.
yeah,
So I guess that's fine. There was objective morality he never showed. Everyone is good is of benefit. Yeah, that is what Javed Akhtar said, right? Like collective good is of benefit. That is why we base on morality on collective good, which isn't actually a bad argument. We were also circling that. And then a category error made by Mufti when he said that if the majority decides like what is right, so why don't you believe in God if everyone, like when the majority believes in God? He is
yeah,
confusing right with truth.
yeah.
What?
Yes,
So
and
that
I
was more
don't
or
think
less
I
what
have
they all talked about.
a lot to say. So there are 3 points I think when you said I noted them down. The first is
Mhm,
uh, even if you accept the complete contingency argument, it does not follow that your God exists. It is
mhm,
basically impossible for anyone to prove. I think that
mhm.
it is impossible for anyone to prove that God can have omniscience, right? Omniscience, and you can prove to an extent that he has the knowledge to create things, but it is impossible to have the complete omniscience, right? That's just
You can prove
non sequitur.
magnanimous knowledge. You cannot actually prove omni knowledge. How do you like demonstrate that? Even any infinite claims, how do you demonstrate that?
Yes, of course. And so there was a beautiful proof actually in one of the books. So
Mhm,
it was an interesting method. So how he did is that we can have a set K that is
mhm,
containing all the knowledge that God can have, and then so let's
mhm,
say there are various propositions in that set K. For example, there is that God knows A, God knows B, God knows C, and so on. Now there is something called the Cantor's theorem, and that theorem basically says that there is a power set for each set. Now, what is the power set? The
mhm,
power set is that there is a combination of all of these propositions, which means that God knows A and B is a separate truth. God knows D and A is a separate truth, and God knows all of these things. The combinatorial set is the power set basically, and uh, the Cantor theorem basically says that the power set must be strictly bigger than the original set because the combinations are of course
mhm.
bigger than the original propositions. Now, the
Right.
problem with omniscience is that you can say that, okay, God has this set K, but
Mhm,
God will never have these, secondary knowledge about himself that I know A and B, I know C and D. Because if he has
mhm,
this set K and he knows something that is bigger than the set K, then that is impossible because he can only know one set of all true propositions. But if he knows a set and that set is bigger than itself, that is basically a contradiction. And so
mhm,
it does not actually prove that omniscience is impossible, it proves that God's internal knowledge is impossible. God cannot have internal
Mhm.
knowledge of himself, that I know
Mhm.
these and these things. And this kind of an argument was presented in, I think, Logic and Theism, that book. It was an interesting argument, and this has
Mhm.
wild implications. Like, you can say,
Right.
if God does not have internal knowledge, then if he
Mhm.
does an action, then the result of that action if it was moral,
Mhm.
then did
Mhm.
God know that whatever he was doing is going to be moral? Because if it just accidentally became moral, then all of his perfect goodness was just accidental. He did not knew anything about what his
Right.
actions are going to be, right? He did not have
For
internal knowledge about what actions will bring up what consequences.
for that, can the Abrahamics use the argument that God's nature, God has whatever nature He has, right? And from our perspective, that nature is always going to be all good. So God Himself is not claiming that He is all good. We are defining good from whatever follows after God.
um I don't think so, because see, first we have to clarify what good even means, because we are defining good just in terms of God. So if it means
Hmm.
that God has some nature X and that is good, then God has that nature. That's just tautological. He has that nature, and whatever that nature is, we have just named it as
That
good.
is good.
Now, of course,
Yeah.
that would just be, that would just follow from what you have said. And the problem again with that is that it gives no independent reason for us to believe what actually is good. It just tells us that God has certain nature X, and whatever you align with that just becomes good. There is no independent
Hmm.
reason of is that action intrinsically good or not. So that can be
Hmm.
some of the things with
I mean,
this problem.
if you consider good to be a separate attribute which God aligns to, then you can make all sorts of arguments. But the main thing that theists and at least Abrahamic claim is that uh, morality or goodness is ontologically dependent on God, right? It emerges out of God. It is a property of God. It is not separate from God, and therefore the when we are trying to evaluate God, we're making a mistake because we are imagining a separate concept of goodness outside of God, and we're trying to align God to it. When definitionally in their framework, goodness is what follows from God. So we're talking about two different things.
Yes, uh, that's that's exactly what I said, because we can agree
Mhm.
upon this, that God has this intrinsic nature and that's just what he is. And I
Right, right,
don't
right.
think that it gives any independent reason. And this is the impossibility of omniscience. The second is physical necessities. Like, if a physicalist or a naturalist has to say that, okay, I don't believe in infinite regress, which we will talk about. Um, but I think that there is a necessary thing, and the physicalist
Mhm.
can very well believe that there is just a physical necessity at the end. And so it can be
Mhm.
all sorts of, like, quantum fields or the boundary conditions of the Big Bang. Because so we have to understand what the Big Bang is, right? Big Bang never claims that the universe began from nothing or something like that. It just says that 13.8 billion years ago, the mathematics used in Einstein's theory of relativity breaks down, and we don't know what happened further. And so we can say that that state was necessary, and it makes a whole lot of
Mhm.
sense rather than saying that there was a non-physical necessity, because it brings the interaction problem, whereas this does not bring. You can just have a physical
I
necessity from
mean,
which physical things go on. And the third is, which is
yeah.
something that we
Mhm.
can briefly consider, is the infinite regress. I want actually your
Mhm.
thoughts on infinite regress, then we can talk about mine.
Sure. So, firstly, the problem with even defining a limit to the universe is that wherever you're going to stop, even if let's say we make up an entire new framework of physics, entire new philosophical axioms, and we are able to figure out, we're able to break that boundary. The necessary being argument is still there, right? Because they'll just go a step beyond. It's always going to be there. No matter how far you go, until and unless you find a full stop, they are going to claim the necessary being. They will still have that contingency argument. That is why it is so reasonable. But the thing again, infinite regress, right? So I simply ask, what is the problem with infinite regress? That is my entire thing. You say that it is not good or that it shouldn't be, but you never demonstrate why it is not good. You never demonstrate why it shouldn't be. If it is logically the conclusion that we are coming to, why must we assume unnecessary endpoint, right? Even when we do okay, so my knowledge in mathematics is really bad. I would want you to correct me if I'm wrong, but like we have limits in mathematics as well, and those are simply uh, those are not those are again assumed limits. Those are theoretical limits. Those are a way to contain what we are talking about, but we do understand it to technically go on forever, right? It just gets so microscopic that it does not, like, it's better to just stop it there. So I don't think the necessary being as a whole thing is logically false. It is a it's something that you want as a conclusion, right? It is the argument from consequences, if you may, that I do not want the consequences of infinite regress. I do not like the conclusion. That is problematic to me, so I am not even going to consider it. I think it's fallacious. I think if everything is coming down to infinite regress, just let what do you call it? Just to admit that. That is also the reason, by the way, the Parabrahman thing, like as a concept, came about in the Vedas, because they had the experience of deities, they had the experience of different realities, they had everything. But the question, I think, I am not very knowledgeable on this, but the question that came up to it was, okay, we find God, we found the heavens above, we found the God of gods, we found everything, but what beyond it? And that is why that concept was Parabrahman, which was later discovered to be awareness by another set of rishis, or at least later on. In at some point they were confused, and later on they came to the conclusion. That is why we have it in the Upanishads. So yeah, the necessary being thing comes out of a compulsion that we have for an ending, for a resolution, and not so it's maybe it's an emotional thing then.
Yes, so there are many things to say. It's, of course,
Mhm,
what you want. So, how Graham Opti puts it is that you must have some prior commitments to have a necessary being, or else there is
mhm,
absolutely no reason to have a necessary being or even a stop at some point. Now, um, so
mhm,
there are, I think, two to three things to be considered here. The first is what theory of time are we using when we are talking about infinite
mhm,
regress? And there
mhm,
are majorly two theories of time: the A theory of time and the B theory of time, which is uh, presentism and eternalism. Now, what presentism says is that present is basically the most real thing, and all the past and the future are not as real as the present is. Um, Now, the you know argument which he also gave in the debate, Mufti gave to Javed Akhtar when he asked that why can't we go infinitely backward, and he said that if there are infinite events backwards, then you cannot pass those infinite events and come to the present because infinity never ends, right? That's the argument which he gave. Now, there are two things. First, when we just consider the A theory of time, we have to ask whether the present even exists. Now, this is, I think, from Plato's work, the beginning of Plato's work, where he questioned, the existence of present as a slice of time, and he asked whether present actually exists. And at the conclusion of the story, it was that present does not exist because, so for example, I want to pick up this pen. Now my wanting is now in the future, and when I pick up this pen, the moment I touch this pen, it becomes the past. We cannot draw a line in between where it was present because that is infinitesimally small line. And so
mhm,
when Mufti says that you cannot traverse the infinite past to come to the present, I would argue that even considering the A theory of time, we never come to the
mhm,
present because there is no present. You actually just keep traversing the past, you keep traversing the past, the future just gets converted into the past. You never come to the present where you can say that now I have traversed the infinite set of events. uh,
mhm,
this can be an intuitive way, a better way, a more scientifically accurate way, is to invoke the B theory of time. Because in Einstein's theory of relativity, he had, that the equation of space-time continuum, the left-hand side and the right-hand side, was basically telling about how matter curves the space-time and how energy bends, all of those things. So there was basically an inclusion of time as a dimension. Right now, Einstein treats time as the fourth dimension. And so how we can understand is that, let's take a map, and in the map, there is India, there is Rome, and all those places. Now, similarly, time is also a map, and
Hmm.
all of the future, present, and past are equally real. They are not unequally real. And so how we can deal with that is that, although we are although we are at the coordinate of India, it does not mean that it does not mean that Rome is not real. It just is in a different
Hmm.
coordinate of space. Similarly,
Right.
how we can say is that the British rule, for example, in India, does exist. It is as real as it is right now. It just is in a different time coordinate, right? It is just in a different slice of the universe, of the spatio-temporal block. And so that is one way. How does this help? uh, it helps us, as we say that, when the argument says that you cannot traverse, we have to say that we are never traversing, we are just changing coordinates. We are not traveling through time, we are traveling with time. That's a difference when you say. And because we don't traverse the infinity, we never come to the problem that we have traversed infinity. And so these can be
Right.
very well two ways to explain that, infinite regress is very well possible. And there is, I think, as more, as much as I have read, there is no book that argues that infinite regress of temporal causes is intrinsically a logical fallacy, as how confidently Mufti put it, that it's a logical fallacy. And it's not at all a logical fallacy, it's just a very well accepted theory.
So another one thing that I want to ask, right, because you like studied this, uh, can there be an instant of time? Because whatever instruments we have to measure time, they have like a specific duration, right? They contain a chunk of time. Second is a chunk of time. Nanosecond is a chunk of time. Minute is a chunk of time, right? Like we at any point calculate a particular instant? If we can't, if time is always in chunks, always in perpetual motion, right, and there is no instance of time, then if that is understood to be the intrinsic nature of time, how can we then logically assume that it had a steady state of where it began? Because a zero state is also just a stopping state, right? It will always be at least an instant. That is the reason you're calling it a starting state.
Okay. So no, we cannot put an instance. So, for example, when in Einstein's theory itself, when we just have time, there is, derivative of time, and that is just a very short amount of time that is infinitesimally small. So it is anything divided by dt. Now, dt just means uh, a basically very small part of time. Now, for example, we can say from 10th second to the 15th second, this is a very big chunk of time. So we take it as delta t, change in time. But if we have insanely small chunks of time, we take it as dt. We take it as dt. And dt is not an instance in itself. It just is infinitesimally small point. We cannot break it and see. Yeah, so I don't think that instances are possible. There is always you can go further and say that a smaller amount of times can be there. And so that's the reason why, even when we uh, so what we observe is that the universe is expanding, and then at what rate it is expanding, through the Hubble's constant, and that's the rate, 70 meters per second per megaparsec. And now we just reverse that, and we take it to the point where Einstein's mathematics shows that it was
It
infinitely
breaks.
dense, infinitely hot. And it just, the mathematics, when we have infinities in physics, we say that it fails. And so it basically shows us that that fails. And time did not begin at that time, because there is a difference between what we philosophers understand as time and what the physicists understand as time. So the difference is, I think, very important. The physicist says that if change is like if change is happening, then there is time. If change is not happening, then there is no time. The philosopher says if change is
Hmm.
possible, then there is time. If change is not possible, then there is no time. The philosopher talks about the possibilities, whether this state can even allow change, and the physicist is more pragmatic. He says, can there be change? Like, do we observe change here or do we not observe change? Right? The
Ah.
physicist wants to observe things. The philosopher wants to say that is it even possible? So when we talk in that, in that sense, then of course I think they don't coincide. But still, I think that even in both senses, there was no beginning of time. Time was, forever existing.
Right. If I mean, very simply put, like for audiences at home, if you cannot, if time can never be an instance, it is the property of time to be in perpetual motion. That is its main property. Then to conclude that time must have a beginning is to conclude that time must have a instant. Time must have a starting point where it was stationary. But if that is never the property of time, then you're introducing a new property and calling it a logical necessity. No, what logically actually follows is that time is perpetually in motion and there was technically no beginning as such, as we understand its nature. And infinite regression then should work even if before the big bang our mathematics breaks, our understanding of change breaks, but from our very own understanding of time's fundamental nature, it should have existed prior to that also, even if we cannot measure it or observe it as such. So infinite regress is therefore more logically consistent with the theory of time rather than a necessary being or a necessary stopping point.
um I think there is one point to say, because I
Mhm.
think what you're implying. So just let me just clarify, or else I will not tell about this. So are you getting to this by saying that infinite regress has a temporal chain of causes always, and so there is seemingly no contradiction? And when we have a necessary thing at the beginning, it seems as if there was an instance of first temporal stage, and therefore it seems to be less parsimonious than the infinite regress. Are you saying this?
Yeah, kind of, because again, the moment like you extend time to beyond whenever, like you're putting the necessary being, and if the necessary being acts within time, and time's nature is to never end, then the necessary being itself becomes something that came within the flow of time, and therefore a contingent being. No, how can it be a necessary being then?
Okay, so um, I don't think that's actually the common view, because so
Mhm.
when we look at necessary beings, for example, if I say that there is a physical necessary at the beginning, what it claims is
Mhm.
that there is a physical entity that eternally exists, right? It never
Mhm.
began, but it is always in time. So it is in time. It never says that it just uh, had the capacity to instantiate time. It was in time, but it was always there. So the second law of thermodynamics, what it says is that you know um, the second law of thermodynamics is one of the only laws which can define time in physics. So what we can say about that is that entropy increases, right? Entropy just means disorderliness. The disorderliness of the universe always increases. Now
Mhm.
when we look at a physical necessity, a physical beginning at the starting, what we can say is that, and this was actually calculated by Roger Penrose. What he said is that the initial stage of the universe was having a very uniform, a very low entropy stage. So it was a very
But
low
it was
entropy
still
stage.
entropious.
Yeah, it was of course entropy, and
There was no
because
zero entropy state, right?
zero
Beyond
entropy
theoretics.
is, yeah, it's not possible. So what we can say that of course there was disorderliness. Now to just give you a very quick example is to say that if there is a hot thing and there is a cold thing, the the flow of heat is always from the hot to cold. It is never from the cold to hot. But this is actually a very big pragmatic appeal that we have done. The second law of thermodynamics, although it says it is actually a statistical law. What does it mean to be a statistical law? It basically says that given large contents, this law will be followed. Given very small contents, if you have just 5 to 10 atoms, then the heat can
Hmm.
actually flow from even the low part to the high part. So what how this matters to the Big Bang thing and the necessity thing is that even though there is low entropy, there is still a very
Hmm.
low chance of it going from low entropy to high entropy, and then from that it will just instantiate the Big Bang, because Big Bang is just the entropy is increasing through the Big Bang's process. And so the necessity at the beginning was eternally there, but because
Hmm.
the chance of increasing the entropy was very low, it happened 13.8 billion years ago, as we know. And the high entropy stage of the universe just began from that point. So it's not the case that the necessary being is somehow uh, problematic because it has an instance of time. It actually exists eternally in time. It just begins things that are physically instantiated.
At a point in time. At
Yeah,
a
at a
point in
point in
time,
time.
that is very big.
Yeah, at a point in
I
time.
can see that. I can see that. But anyway, I think we dived very deep into the contingency argument, and whoever is watching this for the Javed Akhtar and Mufti Shamil thing is has already checked out. So just to conclude, uh, I will state my opinion on this. I think despite how much we've critiqued him in the debate itself, in whatever they were trying to prove as God, which was not Allah, by the way. In the very beginning, he was trying to prove a necessary being. That was the conditions. And he made his arguments, and those arguments were not countered. And as such, I would give him the decision of winning in this debate. Even though he did contradict himself many a times and he did break his own rules. Technically, both should be disqualified, but I would say that he won among the two of them.
Yeah, of course, I would also say the same. He won, given,
Yes.
I don't think that even if we have some sympathy for Javed Akhtar, but of course he did very weakly the argumentation, whatever was done. I think he should have at least,
Yes.
come prepared about the basic terminologies and everything like that. And because at least 3 or 4 times Mufti made him understood what contingency means, and he still asked at the end what contingency means. So I think that's something that we can ignore.
I
But
mean,
still, I would also say
I will
that Mufti won.
actually, I will actually dock points of Mufti for that one because when Javed Akhtar very clearly said that he does not understand contingency, you're telling him dependent and independent beings and or like technical terminology, right? And of course, it was very clear he does not understand that. You have to like simplify it more. So if you're not doing that, that's like I think problematic on Mufti's end. But anyway, Mufti won. I do not like the fact that he won, and the atheists needed a better arguer than Javed Akhtar. I think he got like too high off of his own what do you call or of his own supply because he took himself too seriously given how popular he is on Twitter. But anyway, this was our take on this whole discussion, and I hope whoever checked into this due to the amazing title I gave this video, who did get to learn about a better argument for God, a more in-depth dissection of what contingency is all about, and definitely our back and forth about solving the is to what problem of morality. That was revolutionary. So it was very fun to talk to you again, Vivaswan. I'll see you in the another episode of Apex Arena. And till then, everyone, I compel you to think, analyze, just like Vivaswan here. And remember, as I always say, patterns. They're everywhere.